Do you like angry protagonists and even angrier ghosts? Well, I've got some good news for you because today we are talking about the young adult horror novel She is a Haunting by Trang Than Tran. And this is following newly graduated Jade as her and her sister Lily visit their father as he is renovating a house outside Dala. And they are in Vietnam visiting her mother's family. They are estranged from her father. And there is a lot of history and resentment there from Jade in particular, who is the oldest sibling and watch her father walk away. And she's battling this resentment in combination with needing him, or more particularly needing his help funding college, because she doesn't want to ask her mom to give up more, as she's seen her mom sacrifice for the family again and again. So she goes to this house that her father is renovating with her younger sister. Her younger brother wants no part of it because he doesn't even really know their father. And the deal is they will live there for an extended period, like 4 to 5 weeks. And in that time, Jade will help build a website for this house that is being renovated to rent out to tourists. And while they're there, Lily, her sister, has some illusions and some hopes that this will help reconcile their family. And so she's really going in with a lot of optimism, while Jade is, like I said, going in with a lot of cynicism and resentment, and understandable resentment, as she feels she has stepped into another role of caretaker within the family dynamic. And the book kind of explores later this idea that she was no parent's favorite and what that meant. Not that her mother didn't care for her, but just that she felt like she needed to step in to a different role within the family. And this hurt and resentment is kind of compounded by the fact that before he'd left, before her father abandoned the family in the wake of his grief over losing his mother back in Vietnam, and the fact that all of his family was back in Vietnam, and he kind of assuaged this grief via drinking. But even before that, he had stumbled upon Jade's journal. And she was in elementary school at the time, and her journal articulated some desires that her father did not like, particularly around some of her female classmates. And so since then, Jade has been keeping any explorations of her sexuality and desires very close to her chest. The only person that she has let in is her best friend Hallie, who we know based on the beginning of this book, she has had a falling out with. So Jade is really stepping into this space in this really transformative moment. She is looking to the future, to college. She views this as her opportunity to escape in a lot of ways, to figure herself out. And she has kind of always felt in this in-between, in her family, in the way she is navigating the world and her desires, and also in terms of never feeling enough at home, but when she goes to Vietnam, not feeling enough there either, and alluding to a lot of her insecurities, particularly around her command of the language, both spoken and written, and how she views her identity through the lens of language in a lot of ways. So she is stepping into this house at this precipice of transformation and change in a lot of ways. And at first, this anger is really the only bad spirits in the house. And let's be honest, what teenager hasn't been filled with rage, righteous rage in some cases, at some points in their life? And so we are kind of moving into this space with these feelings. However, these little moments that on their face may not be super creepy start to build up. For instance, when Jade enters the room she's going to be staying in, she finds a windowsill filled with dead bugs. However, she learns her father had painted the windows closed in his renovations, and so there's no air circulating in the room. So there seems to be an explanation for that. But there's also this sense of this just kind of bad energy and something not being quite right. And at first, this can be kind of chalked up to both the energy and the kind of state of mind Jade is entering the house with, but also the kind of colonialist history of this house in particular, because its origins go back to French colonialism in Vietnam, and the main investors of the renovations of this house is a wealthy white couple, the wife of whom has a master's in French Indochina, or as Jade calls it, a master's or a degree in colonialism. And there is a romanticization from her of this period and this time. Meanwhile, we know that Jade and her family have a claim to this house, or we learn that because her father's grandmother, so her great-grandmother, grew up in this house. And so there is this sense of who a home belongs to, where the roots come from, who makes a place a home, and the kind of layers of claiming and colonialism wrapped up in that, further compounded by Jade's exploration of being part of the diaspora and not feeling like she belongs completely anywhere, but seeing her roots in this place and what that means. So as these things kind of build up and she's trying to navigate this relationship with her father, whether whether her father is actually trying to form a connection, how focused and obsessive he really is about this house, even as we see the cracks in the plaster from the outset. So this is being built up as this kind of luxury getaway, this kind of tourist destination. Particularly the unspoken subtext seems to be for white tourists, but as we see the house through Jade's eyes, we see again the dead bugs on the windowsill. There are references to the silverfish kind of eating away. Food in the fridge is rotting overnight and they can't keep the fridge working. So even as the wallpaper is going up, there is this sense that the house is kind of rotting away even as it's being refurbished in a way that even outside of the horror side of things, it's hard to kind of understand how you would ever expect this place to turn a profit. Also, there was a moment in relation to the rot of the house that was still kind of dealing with the bleed over of the real and the imagined. And so it was really focusing on realistic explanations for everything and talking about the windows in a bedroom coming open and how the rain could get in, which totally makes sense and makes sense within the context of that bleeding of barriers of the real and the unreal. However, within consideration of that for the real, I was like, how could you trust people renting this space to take care of it? I guess I just have lost trust with a lot of people and the selfishness of a lot of people. So I could see that where kind of exponentially growing very quickly. And this isn't completely ignored by the narrative by any means. There are references later to this idea that Jade's father has probably bribed people in order for this to pass inspection. So there is this sense that it is a house of cards in some ways, regardless of what side we are looking at things from. However, there is a very clear haunting here. Jade, early in the narrative, has a dream. It talks about sleep paralysis in particular quite a lot. And if that is something that you struggle with, I know I personally have been experiencing those moments where you're in between sleep and waking and you can't move your body a little bit more recently. And to be fair, some of the research that Jade does in the narrative to explain her sleep paralysis also explains the kind of increase in that for myself. However, that is a very prominent theme, this idea of kind of dreams within dreams and kind of what happens when you lose control of your body, where you are physically able to interact with the space, where ghosts and spirits are able to physically interact with you. However, we have these layers to the spirits as well. So the first ghost that Jade meets is Cam, and she meets her in probably one of the creepiest ways that you can meet a ghost, in the light of the refrigerator. And Cam, this ghost, turns around and has a handful of maggots and then wipes these maggots, I think maybe with noodles. The narrative does refer back a lot to a superstition that however many grains of rice you waste in this life, you will have to contend with as maggots in the next. So those do seem intertwined. There is definitely a focus on bugs. So if bugs, the consumption of bugs, anything related to food or the kind of disturbance of food or the possibility of food turning bad or going bad, if you're sensitive to any of that, I would be very aware of that going into this narrative because that is very prominent. There is a lot of grotesque imagery forwarding the horror here. However, there is also this focus on parasites and the parasitic, which is completely in line with this kind of multi-layered exploration of colonialism within both the haunting of the house here and the kind of more realistic plotline of the renovation itself. So in this initial visitation, Cam warns Jade off of eating the food, and there becomes this reoccurring idea or imagery of parasites and how parasites can enter food. And this is kind of twisted and emphasized by Jade's father's emphasis on food and the way he is feeding his girls, and it kind of corrupts this idea of mealtime and the bonding that occurs there. So like I said, there are all of these layers, and within those layers, there is also another ghost. It becomes clear that Cam is not the only ghost, and Jade is further confused by her kind of complicated feelings and attraction to Cam on many levels. However, the former owner of the house, who the investor that Jade doesn't really like talked about in very flowery, complimentary terms, shows up and is a much more malevolent presence in Jade's visions. And Jade feels like this spirit in particular is out to do her family harm. And so she begins to dream about the kind of complicated history between Cam and Marion, this other ghost, learning more about the history of the house itself while trying to convince convince her family, especially her father, that they need to abandon this place, that it is going to be their destruction. However, her father does not believe her and is intently focused on this renovation and his idea of what this renovation will mean for him and his family. And his idea of his family is somewhat warped. There's this idea that Lily and Jade are included here, but there's also this idea that he is trying to reclaim this family history for himself, especially as he has been so separate from his family history since his mother put him on a refugee boat, and he feels very separate and isolated from his siblings and the rest of his family. And so Jade starts to think that the only way to get through to him is to convince him of this haunting that for her is very real, but he does not believe in. And so she enlists the niece of his partner, who she has been kind of grudgingly working on this website with, but has really kept it at arm's length. However, when she needs Florence's help, she enlists her to basically help fake this haunting. And from there, things escalate. The relationship dynamic between Florence and Jade continues to evolve, especially as it's revealed that Florence will be attending college nearby to where Jade's going to be. So they begin to get a little more entwined, even as the house pulls Jade further and further in. And so in combination with this symbolism, particularly in relation to parasites, there is this kind of broader exploration of hunger as well, which I think is especially interesting because we are positioning anger as hunger in some ways. And what are these spirits, these ghosts hungering for? What is the house hungering for? Are they the same? Who is working with who? Who is motivating who? This idea of hunger in relation to how food is portrayed in this book, and the kind of twisting of food here to change it from something that provides sustenance and sustains you to something that can harm you, and how that furthers hunger and desperation. And even within the exploration of the house, there is this kind of through line of hunger, because the house is introduced as a character of sorts, which I do want to talk about. But it has these little interludes, and it starts with mouth, and the first line of the book is, "The house eats and is eaten." And so it really looks at this kind of inevitability. It does talk about like symbiotic relationships, parasitic relationships in that way, and so it really combines the exploration of hunger and parasites in a lot of ways, but really the driver is this hunger, whether that's anger, desperation, this need to belong. There are many facets of it for sure. And in some ways, the many facets of it do get a little convoluted. There is a really complicated history to this house and the interpersonal dynamics, and motivations twist a lot as these characters are pretty inherently twisted in a lot of ways. There, like I said, is this anger kind of underlying everything. So there is definitely also this exploration of how that kind of anger corrupts, but there is also power that is found in that anger. However, we have all of these competing emotions and motivations, which makes it hard to start to untangle some of that as things escalate. And that may be very much on purpose. It may be exploring how these things compound and how these worldviews ultimately corrupt, and corrupt in a way that seeps into the soil in many ways, which is explicitly explored, at least at one point. This idea that this history lives within these walls and what that means, and whose story is getting told even within the spirits that haunt this place. And this place becomes a central factor, and there is a sense of personification to the house, especially within these interludes. However, I feel like this is where it gets the most kind of muddled and convoluted in some ways, because personifying a house is really tricky, admittedly. We've seen it done to some level before, absolutely, whether it be Laura Weymouth's A Treason of Thorns, Sarah Gailey's Just Like Home, but there's a real trickiness to personifying something like a house. And to be fair, on some level, every haunted house is personified in some way. It's the manifestation of the spirit and what lingers, and what causes a spirit to linger, which Jade does touch on with her mom at some point. However, the house here and what the house wants never feels super clear to me, and that is further kind of complicated, like I said, by Marian and Cam's wants within the spirit realm, and even how those change and what changes them. And while I really loved the explorations at play here, especially in relation to the symbolism of the parasites or the kind of metaphor of hunger, it all does start to get a little jumbled, as does Jade's ultimate want. We see her move into this space of telling the house's story because she thinks that's going to be what saves her family. But what exactly is that story? Even even as she tells a specific story, it doesn't ultimately ring completely true. And then from there is where we start to see a lot of the shifting motivations, and it doesn't feel like it ever fully illuminates all of the shades of that story. So I expected the crisis that continued to build out of that revelation of the house's story, which felt like it was going to be some revelation and ultimately wasn't quite what Jade thought it was going to be. I expected that to be further complicated in a more direct way, and I wasn't expecting like a definitive story by any means, to be clear, because I think part of what the book is exploring is how colonialism corrupts and how stories get erased. But it doesn't fully really explore all of those intricacies, I don't think, to its full potential. Additionally, as things escalate, things become much more violent, and Jade in particular becomes much more violent in a way that is kind of hard to reconcile as a reader. I really liked Jade as a character, even amidst her anger and her bristliness, because that all felt very true, and I loved that this narrative gave her anger space, and I believe that the anger started to take up more space as well, and I think that that was part of the escalation toward the end. However, we started to move in a more violent direction, especially at the end, which on one hand makes absolute sense because colonialism is violent and colonialism has cost, and a very real human cost. However, the shift into this moment felt really abrupt, and while we were kind of leading into this descent of the bleeding of reality for Jade, and Jade not knowing what was real and what wasn't, what was dream and what was waking, and I thought all of that was handled in a really smart way in the sense of introducing some of this spirit realm into reality. We see Florence see Cam as well, for instance. So this idea that this isn't all in Jade's head. We never really question, or at least I never did, whether the haunting is something born of Jade's mind. It is real to her, which is part of the reason why when she started faking it, I was a little frustrated as a reader because it felt like it was undermining what she was experiencing. I kind of got it, but I was also like, you're undermining your own credibility. However, teenage brains too. And I do appreciate giving those more questionable moments. It gives us as readers that moment to kind of question her judgment without questioning her perception of reality, and this idea that we don't always have to agree with her judgment to understand her as a character, especially as a lot of these resentments that are kind of deep-rooted in her, she bottles so much up. She has taken on so much kind of emotional labor for her family and her siblings, and so it does hurt to see where especially Lily starts to resent her because she is in direct competition with Lily's dream of them becoming one big happy family again. And so in some ways, this is focused on that explosion of emotion as well, and this exploration of that emotional labor and the emotional baggage, and in many ways, the generational trauma. So we have these really complex, high-level explorations, and yet our characters are doing things that are sometimes questionable. Now, like I said, when we escalate toward the end, we do move into this moment of violence that was pretty jarring for me, and especially because it is a moment where Jade is engaged in some violence, and it really did make me question, you know, what the threshold for my kind of allowance of violence is. Like, what is the moment where I'm like, yes, this character's violence is justified? So it probably is a very successful moment in its exploration of that violence, and kind of shocking the reader system to recognize that the violence has been throughout. So what is the difference between generational violence, systematic violence, oppression, versus a very visceral physical altercation later in the book? So there are levels upon levels in all aspects of this book, and I love that it gives us a protagonist that has messed up. We know on some level that in her break with her friendship with Hallie, we don't know exactly what happened there, but throughout the book, and we do eventually find out, but throughout the book, we get the sense that there is some lingering guilt there. And we question it a little bit because we know that Jade has some lingering guilt in relation to her family and feeling like she is the cause of the breakdown of her family that isn't totally true. So we don't really know if this fallout with her friend is something that she should be feeling guilty for, or is this kind of perversion, again, of her taking on this guilt that really isn't hers. And so we really are kind of exploring this catharsis of emotion through these really scary events. And this idea that this horror and this loss of control is an avenue through which we can explore these higher level things. So ultimately, I really did love how this book interacted with ghosts and the spirit realm, even if I felt like some of the motivations and maneuverings of the spiritual side of things started to get a little muddied as we went on. But we were also exploring a lot of really complex ideas here all at once. So it also could have just been me as a reader not being able to fully isolate and unpack everything, or to see where every part was fully folded into each other. So I ultimately think that this was a really charged, powerful exploration, and I loved that it allowed our protagonist to explore her anger. However, one more final warning that if you are turned off by like maggots, parasites, bugs, consumption of bugs, or the idea that your food could be contaminated, all of that I would argue is kind of some of the most disturbing imagery of this book, even as I think it really expertly blurs the line of reality versus dream and who has control of what, when, etc. So ultimately a charged, creepy, and complex exploration that I think is well worth your time. If you've read this, I would love to hear some of your further thoughts about anything being explored in this novel or any of the characters. But thanks for hanging out and listening to my thoughts as usual. Like, subscribe, comment if you feel like it. All of it really helps, but most importantly, read something good. And yeah, bye.